Welcome to Night Talks, the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications talk show, produced by students for students. I'm Diego Castro, a junior studying public relations, and our guest today is Bob Williams, who received his bachelor's degree in business administration and communications from General Motors Institute in Flint, Michigan. He reported, anchored, and served as the news director in Flint, before moving to Gainesville to serve in many roles at WCJV TV 20. And now he's an instructor at Wiles Elementary, as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for being here today.
Diego, thank you for having me.
So residents in North Central Florida already know you.
I hope so.
Yeah. But you're originally from Detroit. So
Yes.
Can you tell us more about your childhood and growing up?
It was very interesting being in Detroit during that time in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, when the automobile industry was thriving very well at the time, which is why one of the reasons I went to General Motors Institute, which is now Kettering University now, because the auto industry actually had a college that helped provide business administration, communications, engineering, and various backgrounds to all of its locations, as well as locations for other automobile manufacturers. So that was the reason why they started their own college. And I majored in industrial business administration, but my minor was in communications because I was always interested in the communication industry.
Right.
But growing up during those times, they were very prosperous for the automobile industry. And after what was called the Arab oil embargo, which meant that the Arabs were withholding oil, the price of oil went up significantly. The demand for big, large, gas-guzzling cars like GM and other automobile manufacturers were making went down dramatically, and they had to retool. And as a result of that, the automobile industry had to cut back seriously and cut down seriously. And we had a lot of layoffs during that particular time period. So I was a victim of one of those layoffs after college. I was doing just fine and everything was dandy, rolling in dough, and all of a sudden the trap door opened and I fell through. But that's okay.
Right.
But that's why you have a minor, is because you use that for a backup plan.
Gotcha. You studied business administration, you had the minor in communication. Things just didn't work out with the business and they didn't work out with General Motors, so that's when you made the switch to communications, correct?
That is correct. I had one intermediate stop in between. I worked actually a little bit in the communications field by working for the phone company. We had Bell South at the time.
Bell South,
it was Michigan Bell
in the day.
Up there,
yes.
back in the day.
Yes.
So I was in the communications part on the telecommunications side, but from a phone industry standpoint. And then I made my way into television from there and started at a local television station in Detroit, just as a production assistant, the spot that many students start at out of college, is working as a production assistant for a very large television station. At the time, it was a ABC owned and operated station.
You must have felt amazing coming out of school, like having that job already and feeling good.
And feeling good, and I needed it after the layoff, but it felt very good to be able to rely on my minor and work in the communications field. And my first job there, after being a production assistant for a while, it was to be a writer. And that's how I learned how to write news copy fairly well.
Now I want to go back to the beginning really fast. How early did you know that you had an interest in communications, or like did you have any favorite programs as a kid that you would watch that inspired you to go into TV and work in communications?
Well, in our family growing up, there was always the Huntley Brinkley Report each weeknight at 6:30.
Right.
And we all, as a family, sat down, and my father made us watch the news every
bonding,
single evening. And my interest in news came from being a young boy sitting in front of the television set watching the news every evening and watching Huntley Brinkley Report on NBC. And that sparked my interest. I always kind of had a bug, if you will, that at some point or another in my career I wanted to be on television or to do television reporting. And then when I got into high school, there wasn't any kind of news writing or anything along those lines. Whatever kind of thing that you did on stage was what your introduction was to being comfortable in front of an audience and comfortable in front of a camera.
Absolutely. It's funny you say that because a lot of high schools don't have a strong communications course offering. So a lot of times students come into college and this is their first introduction, like this set right here, is their first introduction of anchoring and reporting. So it's a great that you had an early start to that.
Yeah, and of course right now it has evolved. I mean, I work at the elementary school, like you mentioned, Wiles Elementary. We have our own little morning newscast now. So
That's crazy.
even fourth and fifth
For the morning
graders
announcements.
are doing their morning announcements. The high schools are doing their own newscasts and things along those lines, and have their own studios even. So it really has evolved, and students who are interested in our business have a much more of an opportunity to jump in much earlier than it was when I was in school.
Right. You said you were writing in Detroit. What kind of writing material were you doing in Detroit?
I was doing news copy, and we called it a writer's pit. It was actually a lower part of the floor where all the writers would write the news copy for the day for the anchors to read. The anchors didn't write their own copy, news writers wrote it. And we had a copy editor who would edit the copy that we would write, and then we would do the retypes. We were on the typewriter back then, not on
Back
computers.
in the day, oh my God, the typewriter.
We were actually retyping
I'm like one
scripts.
mistake and you have to restart, right?
And restart the whole
thing. Oh my God,
thing.
I can't even imagine that. I can't even imagine that.
It was a big transition.
You went from Detroit and then you said that you went to Flint. So how did you get started at WEYI TV in Flint?
Well, when I was in Detroit as a writer, I still had the passion to do on-air reporting, worked with the reporters there in the larger market, and applied for positions throughout Michigan. And Flint was a small enough market and a close enough market where I could get my start. So that's where I got my first start in television as a reporter as WEYI TV in Flint. And I worked my way up there to become a member of the management team there. I anchored the newscast
So you
there,
grew with them as a team.
and I
there.
grew with them as a team. It was a small team at the time. There were only 6 of us.
Oh, wow.
And we were only producing one newscast a day. But it was a great experience, and being out in the field with another reporter, because we worked in teams and each had a territory to cover, was great work experience for me.
Now this was in the early 80s. What did reporting look like at that time? I imagine it was different than what multimedia journalists experience today.
We had graduated from film. We started using videotape, and we had these huge cameras that we had to lug on our shoulders, and the cameras didn't record, they just did the video portion. We actually had to record on a big cassette tape recorder.
The audio
so
recording.
one shoulder had your videotape cassette, and the other shoulder had your camera. And we were trudging around with tripods in place and big, heavy 25-pound or so cameras and recorders to get the news every day, and then come back and then had to edit it with videotape editors. It was a lot different. The pace had to be a lot slower because we had to deal with taking equipment in and out and back and forth, and certain days the cameras are a little bit picky because you would go from outdoors to indoors, they would fog all up, and you wouldn't have the ability to record because the audio recorder was not working. So those were some challenging days, but you know, we eventually amassed and grew in technology like the country and the world were growing. And it didn't happen overnight. It was something that took a lot of stations a long time to eventually get from videotape to analog and high 8 cameras and smaller cameras and 1 unit cameras that did both video and audio. So it took about 10 years plus
Wow, that's
in order to get
crazy.
to that point. And then there was a transition period where you were going from VHS tapes, okay, to almost high 8 or almost like cassette tapes to eventually digital. So that leap, I would say, usually a decade, and then another decade, and then another decade.
right. In Flint, what kind of stories did you guys cover?
Primarily, I covered government. I covered a lot of politics and government, both in the city, on the city level, and on the county level. And then we also had general assignment reports that we had to do. But surprisingly, and maybe not so surprisingly, but a lot of automotive, because remember, I'm in the Midwest,
Yes.
in the industrial Midwest.
booming.
And it's growing, it's booming, and the economy is so tied to the automobile industry. We did a lot of stories about the automobile industry, in addition to me covering the government and the political scene.
You make a big move from Flint to the beautiful Gainesville, Florida that we're at now. What was Gainesville offering you that Flint, Michigan wasn't offering you?
A job. Yeah, that was the biggest thing.
Correct.
Again, the automobile industry was going down. That forced me to make my first move into television. Well, the television industry was going down also. That forced me to make my next one to Florida, was because the station that I was at was not doing very well because the automobile industry was not doing very well. And so we ended up actually canceling, which is unheard of today, our news. And I came here, and like I tell people, I was a fly that got stuck on flypaper. Never left.
You began at WCJB as a reporter and then held many different roles. What kind of roles were you doing, and what was your favorite role?
Yeah, I like to say I had the 7-year itch. Seems like every 7 years I was getting another
clockwork.
position at CJB, because I started as a reporter and I covered the city of Gainesville and Alachua County. That was my beat, the city county government beat. 7 years later, I started anchoring the morning newscast and the 12 o'clock noon newscast, in addition to reporting. That probably was my favorite part, because I had a little bit of hands in both pots.
Right.
I could be out in the field reporting, which I love to do, and then I could also anchor the noon news. As soon as the noon news was over at 12:30, I would go out and grab stories and report on stories for the 6 o'clock newscast. So that was probably my favorite part. Then I got the 7-year itch again, and then I became the news director at the station and was in charge of every part of the newscast, including the hiring of all the staff.
So you're the big
at
boss. You were the big
newsroom.
boss for a sec.
That part, yeah. And then another 7-year itch, and I became a station manager and was in charge of not only the news department, but the production department, the engineering department, the sales department, and other departments at the station. And then it became the community service and public affairs manager.
So were there any major news stories that you covered?
Yeah, there were quite a few major news stories. Of course, the one that comes to mind, obviously, that everybody remembers is the college student murders in 1990. So that was a very big story for not only the Gainesville area, but also the country at large. I was very interested in the students that were unfortunately killed during the college student murders by Danny Rowling. So that was one of the biggest stories.
Can you share with us so that our audience knows what exactly happened?
Yeah, it started with the death, unfortunately, the murder, we found out later, of 2 UF students just as school was starting in 1990. The kids were coming back on campus. It was August, and just before Labor Day break, and a serial killer started in the city of Gainesville and Alachua County, and took the lives of students.
So Bob, when a story goes from it being a local story and it turns into nationwide news,
Right.
how is reporting different?
It becomes much more competitive because you've got stations from not only all around the state of Florida kind of invading, quote unquote, your territory, you've got national networks coming in to try to cover the story as well. And you have an advantage by being the local person. People know you, people trust you, and a lot of the people that you need to talk to interview are familiar with you and feel much more comfortable giving you interviews as opposed to strangers that have come from other parts of the state or other parts of the country that are coming in. There's a little bit of an aversion to having foreigners, if you will, come into our local area to try to cover a story. But at the same token, you're part of a network of groups. In our case, we were part of, the ABC network. So we worked with them, and some of the things that we were able to get, we shared with the network, and they shared things that they were able to get with us in order to give our audience the complete coverage. But it does change the dynamics dramatically when a local story becomes a national story, because it gets a lot more attention. And for us, there's a lot more pressure to make sure that we, A, cover the story for our local folks, and B, make sure that the correct image and impression of our area goes out on the national news.
How was it, trying to fight for the space, or trying to not fight for the space, but
No, you're right.
Yeah,
Fight for the space, because a lot of times we tried to get elbowed out of certain things because some of the big name folks were coming in from New York or Los Angeles or Atlanta, and they would try to bully or push us around and things along those lines. But having those connections with the local people made a difference. So for example, when I needed to interview the sheriff of Alachua County at the time of the college student murders, I would get priority over somebody from the national network. And our local officials who worked with us let it be known that, look, just because we're in a small market and a small station doesn't mean that you can push, Bob to the side to ask your questions. We're gonna, and when we have our news conference, make sure that our local folks are taken care of first.
Bob, what were some of the largest challenges that you faced as a reporter?
I think probably one of the biggest challenges that I had, and I think most reporters have, is trying to get truthful, accurate information, getting people to open up and give you the information that you really need to do an adequate and good story. There's so many misconceptions about, quote unquote, the media, and we're being the enemy as opposed to the media being someone that can help you and work with you. So some of the things and biggest challenges is to try to convince people that you're not out to try to get them, to ruin their reputation. We're just trying to get the information to pass on to the public, and we're not trying to ambush you or make you look bad or say that you've done something wrong. Maybe you have, and you have something to hide, but our job is to try to get the facts and the information and give you an opportunity, if you need to defend yourself. So, but that's one of the biggest challenges, is to getting over that myth that most people have about the media in general. It's the media's fault, and we're always the ones that are responsible for everything and anything that goes wrong sometimes.
Right. When you are reporting, you said that it was the most challenging to get truthful and accurate information. Do you have any tips on how you can level with the person you're speaking with, just so to make them comfortable, or just any questions that would make them, be truthful towards you?
The biggest thing is to establish a relationship with the individuals. That is probably the key thing. If they have a relationship with you and they trust you, then they will open up to you, because the biggest barrier is to get people to open up, because they're always real tight and wondering, what's his objective, what is he or her?
How is he going to spin this around?
Yeah, how is she going to make me look bad? So if you can establish a relationship, is one of the things that I also teach in my class, is establishing a relationship through repeated contact with an individual is the best way to get the information that you need. And the other thing is show people that you're human too, that there's a human side to you and you bleed the same way that they do, to hopefully help you bring those barriers and that wall down to get people to open up to you and trust you. Those are some of the things that, I tell reporters, don't go in there with a microphone and stick it in somebody's face and say, why did you do this way or that way? Get comfortable with them, make them feel at ease with you. And sometimes just a simple word like, tell me a story, Diego. And you open the story, okay? And you'll be surprised what you learn and what you find out.
The reason I ask you is because I'm in reporting right now, and one of the biggest challenges is going up to people and just trying to come off as inviting and not someone who's trying to attack you or, so just being inviting and showing, like you said, that you're human too and we just want to talk is one of the biggest challenges for me in reporting. So that's great advice for me to know. So obviously working media can be stressful. How important was it for you to have a support system?
Very supportive, both personally and professionally, to have a support system. Professionally, if you don't have someone that's willing to have your back when you're doing something controversial, or somebody to help you out in terms of giving you a source or giving you a lead or helping you get some information that you may have trouble getting, then you're not going to be as successful as you can be. But if you've got that person behind you that will share that tip of information with you, or hey, you might know so-and-so, he might be able to help you with this and give you some additional background information or facts that will help you with your story. So having your fellow journalists as well as people in the public who you've built a relationship with that will more than likely help you in the long run by either helping you directly or referring you to somebody who can help you and give you the information that you need as a support system.
That's the power of connections right there, isn't it? So after 30 years in the news field, which is an incredible amount of time, that's just incredible, you transitioned into education.
Right.
What inspired that career change and how rewarding is it for you to be an educator now?
Well, even as news director, while I was still active in the news business, I was in charge of the internship program. That was one of the things that I had a relationship with the university with, is through the internship program. And I found myself really taking journalists by the hand that were coming over from the University of Florida and helping them grow. And that was very rewarding and satisfactory for me. And I always had an interest in eventually knowing that this pretty face wasn't going to always be on television anymore. That eventually, as I aged, I need to transition to future journalists and helping them grow and learn. And that's what started me in education at the college level. And then at the elementary school level, which is where I teach as well, there was always a keen interest. At one point, I came from a family with a lot of teachers in it, and I wanted to do something like they were doing, and they would always talk about how rewarding teaching was, and that attracted me to teaching at the primary education level.
What did you learn from college students, and what did you learn from elementary students?
They're not that much different. Believe it or not, they're not that much different. They're both very eager to learn in many cases, and hopefully in most cases, eager to learn, and they're most times open to instruction, and they're like sponges. They want to know how to do things first, and then how to get better at what they think they know. I think the two groups are very similar in that facet in terms of their growth and learning potential and what they're looking for. And then the college students are looking for, okay, what can I learn from you and how can you teach me to get that first job or that next job or to be able to earn an income and graduate college. So their focus is getting the next level to the point where they're self-sufficient, have a job, and starting their career. Whereas the younger students, they're interested in what do I need to do and how do I get to college or to a profession, a skilled profession, either that requires college or a skilled profession that doesn't, where I can learn a skilled trade. So in many respects, they're not that much different. They both throw tantrums and they both do good jobs, and sometimes they do bad jobs. They both try to skate and get
Right.
by a little bit, or
And
you know.
sometimes they need a bad grade.
All of a
It's true.
sudden, you know,
sure.
they check out early, you know,
no.
as we get closer to
No.
break time, you know, and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So there's some similarities.
What grade are you teaching, or were you teaching in elementary?
At the elementary school, I'm actually doing K through 5. So I'm in all grade levels
Wow.
of the elementary school level, from kindergarten all the way up to 5th grade. So it's a very good variety. No 2 days are the same, very much like the news business. And each day is a challenge, just like the news business.
Right. So I'm getting the feel that you like to be challenged, you're adaptable. What advice would you give to any viewers who are currently studying reporting and aspiring to work in news?
Develop a passion. Find out what you're good at. That is one of the hardest things to do, is to find out what you are passionate about and good at doing. Are you a really good writer? Are you a really good storyteller? Are you really good interviewer? Are you really good at visuals and visualizing things or picturing a story or how it comes together? Are you really good at putting the pieces of a puzzle together and producing something? Are you really good at directing people and giving them direction and being a leader? So find out what you're really good at and what you're really passionate about. And sometimes you may find what you're really good at and what you think you want to do might not necessarily be the same thing. It's great if they are the same thing, but be open to finding out other things that you might be surprised that you come a little bit more natural to you, and things that you're actually good at that you didn't really realize that you were so good at.
That's amazing advice. Just keep going to try different things just to make sure that you are getting that full experience, that you're getting what you need to do.
And be well-rounded.
Correct. Thank you so much, Bob, for
You're
your
welcome.
insight. I really
I
appreciate
appreciate
you. Thank you for our viewers for joining us. Until next time, good night.